Hello, this is Ben, and today we will talk about something different. I like to think, and I've always said racing is a thinking man's game. Whoever has a better understanding of what is really going on and got a grasp of the situation at hand, you'll go quicker. And I remember back then when I was running nitrous oxide years ago, and I told my mentor, may he rest in peace, Charles Stevens, I think I want to go beyond nitrous oxide and some of the blowers. I'm going to go back to NA. And he goes, when do you want to do it? I said, well, now. He goes, let's do it. And from that point on, my scope of understanding really expanded, and I could make power better than I did before because I had a better understanding of what's really going on. We will never really get the complete picture because technology evolves and everything else that goes with it, the dynamics of compression, ignition, exhaust, and back to intake. It is very complex, okay? And maybe I've been thinking too much into the game, but I kind of figured I like it. And I hope that the days of electric cars don't come because all this technology as far as ignition, valve train, cam technology, cylinder head development, all that is going to be out. You're going to just have voltage and amperage. Totally a boring outlook in the future of racing if that's what happens. So anyway, let's start with this discussion about how I feel turbos tend to be easier on the engine compared to NA, nitrous oxide, or supercharging. Either be roots type blower or centrifugal. Turbos, from what I've seen through the years, tend to be a lot easier. And I'm looking at that when every time I take these engines apart, I'm going, okay, something is going on here. Why is it a point that very many people miss? Altogether, they say turbo is just as hard on the engine as supercharger. So, of course, it's hard on an engine if you go beyond your ignition tables and your air-fuel ratios. If you go way out, nothing will save your engine. I don't care if it's made out of the trickiest material from here or outer space. It's not going to work. Okay, you're going to destroy it. The forces of combustion is just like a bomb. Okay, so when somebody says to describe the combustion chamber, oh, my combustion chamber, which I did back in the two-stroke days, one very well-known engine guy says, oh, my combustion chamber is very, very explosive. I go, wow, explosive. Is very explosive, or is the proper term a fast burn combustion event? When you say explosive, I don't care if you got 4-bolt main, 8-bolt main, billet this, billet that, you're not going to contain it. Okay, you're gonna freaking blow that sucker up into nothing. Now, okay, let's start with our original discussion here, what I wanted to say about the turbo engine's ability to be easier on the bottom end. Now, to start off, we're talking about 4-stroke cycles, okay? Intake, compression, ignition, and exhaust. Now, there's one important element there that will come into our discussion here, is the overlap. Really, the notion of saying these engines, the spark ignited combustion engines, are 4-stroke cycles is not really correct. It's really a 5-cycle engine because of the fact that the 5th cycle overlap is such an important part of the combustion process, because overlap takes in more of the intake column coming into the intake port. Overlap ingest more than the piston going down, 45 times more. Because if you have to rely on just the piston going down to ingest the fuel or the mixture in, there's what you call a lag time. When the valve opens up and the piston starts to come down, no. It will be lagging behind, and you're not going to get the full amount of volumetric efficiency that you're trying to achieve into this combustion space. So really, overlap happens when the piston's still going up and the intake valve is opening. And think about that. You'd think, oh, okay, then the flow would start to push back. It does not. Exhaust comes into play. during the overlap when both vents are open. Okay, the signal from the exhaust with everything going downstream the pipe will yank on the intake and hopefully go into the combustion chamber, not out the pipe, which is a possibility, but we'll talk about that later on. Now, overlap, like I said, is very, very important. Now, where does the load factor on a turbo engine, what has overlap got to do with it? Very, very big. Now, after this video, I will talk about, here we are, is that NA versus turbo. Then we'll go turbo versus supercharger, and turbo versus nitrous oxide. And by the time we get into those subjects, and I'll split them into different videos, it just takes too long. What we're going to be looking at is, will be obvious why a turbo engine exhibit a lot less load. Now, okay, I'm timing myself here. Let's start with NA. NA engines, a lot of the load at RPM has got a lot to do with the overlap phase. Now, when the exhaust, when the piston comes down after the ignition event, okay, it starts to come up, and a lot of the spent gases are here and gets pushed out the exhaust. That's a given, all right? So while this is rapidly going up, the exhaust valve is open and the piston is chasing the exhaust valve out while it's closing. And then closer to TDC, the intake valve starts to open. Mind you, piston's still coming up and the intake valve opens. Without the overlap, the flow will go back because the piston's still coming up. You're trying to anticipate. You're opening the valve, intake valve, earlier than you usually do so that you anticipate the flow. Now, with the overlap in the equation, the signal of the rapidly moving exhaust reflects on the intake, okay? And when both valves are open, exhaust is closing, intake start open, that reflected pressure gets drawn in by the exhaust, the rapidly exhausting flow column there. It hopefully you take it into the combustion chamber, not through the pipe, so your volumetric efficiency sometimes exceeds 100%. You know, 110, 115% is not rare. So this column gets drawn in by the exhaust. That's part of the equation. But here's the deal, okay? While the piston's coming up and the intake valve starts to open, the exhaust is starting to close, this force gets drawn in like this. Guess what the load is on that piston? The piston is being sucked up. I hate to say the word suck, it does not exist, but the low pressure, the force of low pressure or absence of pressure wants to shove that piston into the combustion chamber, okay? Because you have this tube rapidly coming out, some of the intake is staying here, okay? The low pressure or vacuum, like they say in automotive, vacuum creates this thing and wants to push the piston up to the combustion chamber like this. Now, that force in itself is very, very hard on that connecting rod, okay? Because piston coming up, exhaust is still open, slowly closing, piston's chasing exhaust, intake valve starts to open, it draws in the mixture, and the piston on this upward momentum wants to get shoved into the combustion chamber. That is when rod stretch, I believe, happens. Because when I look at the wear pattern, I see a lot of wear on this side on an NA engine. That's telling me it's getting pushed out. This column is yanking that, shoving the piston up to the combustion chamber. And if there's really not enough strength here, that rod will break and shove itself into the piston, into the combustion chamber or to the cylinder head. How many times have you seen a big combustion chamber with a hole with the piston and shoved itself into there? That's exactly what happened. This force is magnified 4 or 5 times fold and wants to shove the piston. That's NA. Think about the same scenario on a turbo engine, okay? Ignition happens, exhaust, okay, piston comes down, okay? It starts to rotate down and go up. Exhaust valve is wide open, piston's coming up fast, intake valve starting to close. The intake starts to happen. Now we have a turbo engine. Let's just say, instead of a vacuum here, trying to shove that piston up into the combustion chamber by the force of what's actually happening during overlap. Let's say we have 35 pounds of boost here. 35 pounds of boost. Piston coming up. Intake valve starts to open. Instead of seeing a vacuum that's shoving this piston into that combustion chamber, you get 35. Oh gosh, let me see. Oh my God, it's early in the morning, man. It's only like 8 o'clock here. The 35 psi here is reflected on top of that piston and holds that piston down like this. Okay, not like on a NA combination. You have vacuum. It's piston's coming up, exhaust is starting to close, intake starts to open up. The big vacuum or absence of pressure situation between these three, the intake column, the combustion chamber, and the exhaust, rapidly depleting exhaust, creates this low pressure. And what actually happens is that the piston wants to get shoved into the combustion chamber. Now on the turbo, 35 psi or even 15 psi, piston's coming up rapidly, intake valve starts to open. But now instead of having a vacuum here in this column, you have boost. And when you have this boost, it holds the piston in place. So on NA, during the overlap phase, the connecting rod is like somebody trying to hit you in your face, and you miss and you pull your shoulder. That's why you see the rod witness marks, the stress on NAs, a lot of them here. And that's where you break the rod. Now on a turbo, when the intake valve opens and exhaust still open, it has this cushioning effect. So while you're punching the combustion chamber, there's a force holding it back. Okay? So during the overlap phase, exhaust valve is open, intake valve is opening up. Okay, and the exhaust valve is closing rather than opening, closing. There's the pressure from here holding the piston, slowly come up to TDC and start to come down. That cushioning effect of boost is what keeps this load factor on the connecting rod, piston, and everything else bottom end in check. Remember the word, in check. 35, 45 psi, or some of the other guys even higher than that. But let's just say 15 psi, better than a vacuum, because a 15 psi holds the rod in check and puts a little cushion to it coming up to TDC. You guys get it? We don't have that in NA. NA, that's freewheeling. It's like swinging at nothing, swinging at nothing. Okay? And when it's swinging at nothing, it has a tendency to stretch the rod, load up the pin, and smack the freaking head into the piston. It's just a fact that is out there. Overlap creates that. Stretching and everything. With the rod, seeing instead of a constant vacuum, the forces of low pressure yanking on that piston to shove up, now you got 15, 30, 28 pounds holding it back. So it's a cushioning effect. Okay, when it's coming up, the boost cushions the rod. Therefore, I really believe NA creates a lot of stress on that rod, especially on the rod bolts during the overlap. Now, when you float the valves because of you lose control of the valve train or too much RPM, nothing stops this piston from climbing up there. Okay? You're really gonna smack the combustion chamber with your piston. I don't care if you're 6-to-1, 5-to-1. It's gonna stretch, and but if you have that low compression, you shouldn't even be racing. Okay, build a lawnmower or something. You're not gonna go anywhere with that. Now, just visualize. The more boost here, within limits, of course, the more it cushions that piston. You get it? The more boost. 15 psi is good. 30 psi, double that, is even better for as far as this is concerned, about the piston smacking the combustion chamber. 45 psi is even better than that, within limits of where you place your ignition tables at. But if you got 45 psi, it'll be a lot better than 15 pounds, a lot easier on that connecting rod, piston, and pin. Okay? Basically, that's the scenario you're looking at. The boost creates the cushion from the piston smacking the combustion chamber in the overlap phase. I hope that's clear. I've thought about this for many, many years, and I'm thinking, why do I see the turbo engines having a lot easier witness marks or wear pattern on the rod, on the connecting rod? And I spoke to a very well-known crank guy here, and we spoke at length with a buddy of mine, Danny Ruiz from Los Angeles. We were on the phone for about 45 minutes, and I said this exact scenario to this crank guy. Wow, he's a good guy. And he was really stunned. He was speaking, he goes, Ben, do you mean to tell me you stated correctly that boost cushions the rod from slapping the head? I said, yes. Okay, because on an NA, you have vacuum. There's nothing stopping that piston from shoving into the head, because you're on a constant vacuum and it wants to pull it up. Now, if you got 45 psi, I told him, reflected in this combustion chamber, piston comes up and feels this boost and starts to slow down, holding it in place. And he was speechless for a moment. He goes, you know what, man? He goes, I never thought of such scenario, but you make a lot of sense. So I'm forwarding it to everybody here and see what you guys think. But I feel that is what's going on. Boost in the overlap phase, okay, where a lot of the dynamics that wants to go out of control as far as RPM is concerned is present with a boosted engine. We'll touch bases on nitrous oxide and roots type or centrifugal blower. It has a same scenario, but a little bit different, okay? So what I'm saying is that I believe, this is an opinion, boost creates a lot, on a turbo, creates a lot less dynamical stresses on the rod, crank, and piston at speed, okay? That is by itself such a big, how should I say it, factor. That's why when I've done a lot of magazine interviews for, different Peterson Publishing, HP books and all that, and the writers, whenever they talk to me, and I said, turbo is a lot easier on the engine because of the boost presence on the overlap phase. You see that they kind of like, huh, I didn't explain it as much as I did here, but I noticed that they have that confused look, like, how can that be? Okay, because I always accompany that statement. I go, if you're good for 800, 900 horsepower NA on a Ford or Chevy or Chrysler, you can double that on turbo because there's a lot less stress. And I go, if you're good for 900 horsepower, you're good for 18 or 2000 and beyond on a turbo. And is that, no, they equated horsepower that's raised up to be an incremental increase in stress on the block. Yes and no, all right? Because the factor of the boost cushioning the rod and everything else down below it, okay, and the piston creates such a positive dynamics that further increases your longevity or the ability of the engine to take the punishment of combustion. Okay, so I hope it's clear. Hey, I'm doing this on the fly. It's early morning and I'm about to go on a trip, and I figured I better do this before I leave. Anyway, please subscribe and like Ben Alameda Racing on YouTube, and so I can keep this going on, and we'll follow this up with turbo versus, this was NA versus blower, and then later on that was roots and centrifugal, and then turbo versus nitrous oxide. Oh, nitrous oxide is nasty, okay, but it has its pros and cons compared to the others. All right, so please like and subscribe to Ben Alameda, and I'll follow this up with another segment. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.